London terror. A homemade bomb wounds nearly 24 as the UK threat level remains at severe. North Korea missile launch. Another test from the rogue nation has Japan on high alert. Healthcare overhaul. Some lawmakers haven't given up on replacing Obamacare, how a new bill could impact pro-life protections. And mowing the lawn. We'll tell you why an 11-year-old boy was put to work at the White House today. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, September 15th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee in for Lauren Ashburn. A rush-hour blast on a London Underground train is being treated as terrorism by the city's police. Authorities say the explosion was caused by an improvised explosive device, or IED. At least 29 people were hurt, most suffering flash burns. But there are no serious injuries. It happened this morning at the Parsons Green station. British police say no one has been arrested in connection, but hundreds of detectives are at work trying to hunt down those responsible. London's mayor condemned the attack and says police are working to protect the city.
So we've seen attacks in Barcelona, in Brussels, in Paris, in Rotterdam, in Stockholm, and of course in Manchester in Europe. I'm reassured that the police and security services are doing all they can to keep us safe.
The mayor added Londoners will not allow terrorists to disrupt their way of life. President Donald Trump calls for a tougher U.S. travel ban in response to the London bombing. He's calling the explosion another attack by a loser terrorist. Correspondent Mark Irons reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The president wants his travel ban targeting 6 mostly Muslim nations to be not only tougher, but larger and more specific. The president suggests that London police missed an opportunity to prevent this incident, and he doesn't want that to happen here in the U.S.
President Trump responds to the terror attack in London.
No, it's a terrible thing. It just keeps going and going. And we have to be very smart. We have to be very, very tough. Which perhaps we're not nearly tough enough.
Trump called Prime Minister Theresa May to offer sympathy and prayers for the victims. Earlier in the day, May said that Trump's initial reaction to the attack wasn't helping.
I never think it's helpful for anybody to speculate on what is an ongoing investigation.
The British Prime Minister referring to an early morning tweet storm from the president who said, "Another attack in London by a loser terrorist. These are sick and demented people who were in the sights of Scotland Yard. Must be proactive. Loser terrorists must be dealt with in a much tougher manner. The internet is their main recruitment tool, which we must cut off and use better." The president continues. The travel ban into the United States should be far larger, tougher, and more specific, but stupidly, that would not be politically correct. We have made more progress in the last 9 months against ISIS than the Obama administration has made in 8 years. Must be proactive and nasty. Out in the Rose Garden today, Trump repeated that message.
We have to be tougher and we have to be smarter. Thank you.
Trump's travel ban has been ensnared in the courts since his first attempt to enact the policy in January. The Supreme Court is scheduled to hear arguments October 10th on the legality of bans on refugees anywhere in the world and travelers from 6 mostly Muslim countries. Wyatt.
Mark, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has asked the Trump administration to allow more refugees into the U.S. There are reports that the administration wants to lower the refugee cap. Is that the case?
A White House official would not confirm those reports, but did say refugee resettlement will be guided by the safety and security of the American people and the protection of U.S. taxpayers and the application of U.S. resources in a manner that stretches U.S. dollars to help the most people. Wyatt.
Correspondent Mark Irons reporting from the White House. Thanks, Mark. Vice President Mike Pence's press secretary confirms to us today he is stepping down from his position. Mark Lauder, who has been on EWTN News Nightly, has served in the role since the beginning of the administration. He says his last day will be September 29th. 2 major pro-life groups endorse a last-ditch effort to replace Obamacare and defund Planned Parenthood for 1 year. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi says the clock is ticking to get the bill passed. Good evening, Jason.
Wyatt, Republicans promised to repeal Obamacare will die if they can't pass a bill this month. That's because they're using a rare procedure to approve it without Democratic votes. And tonight, pro-life groups the Susan B. Anthony List and Family Research Council say this latest bill is their best chance to make good on campaign promises.
Pro-lifers should be very excited.
The Family Research Council praises Republicans' last-ditch plan to replace Obamacare. Its treasure trove of pro-life provisions would defund Planned Parenthood, allow states to opt out of the HHS contraceptive mandate, and stop Obamacare's taxpayer funding of abortion.
The principle here is abortion is not health care. The federal government taxpayers shouldn't be forced to subsidize it.
These Republican senators unveiled their health care proposal this week. It shifts federal health care dollars back to the states, so the states have more local control. And those dollars cannot go to abortion plans.
It's the best and last hope for the Republican Party to show that we have ideas and that our ideas are better than our friends on the other side.
Senator Lindsey Graham urges the country's governors to get on board, and he welcomes the vice president's support.
Mike Pence has been great. He's been on the phone. He says we're 1,000% on board.
Senator Bernie Sanders unveiled a competing health care bill this week. It includes several pro-abortion provisions.
Health care in America must be a right, not a privilege.
Planned Parenthood praises Sanders' Medicare for All bill while blasting the latest Republican plan. They tweet, "Trump care is back with a new plan to take health care from millions and defund Planned Parenthood." And this sets up a big political brawl this month with pro-lifers like David Christensen.
We need the conservative pro-life community to rally and get this across the finish line. President Trump will sign it.
Senator Graham urges President Trump and Senate Majority Leader McConnell to make an intense push right now for this new GOP plan. Republicans have struggled to get the 50 votes needed to pass earlier versions, but some conservatives don't like this latest draft. Wyatt?
Jason, why are those conservatives so upset?
Well, lobbyist groups like Heritage Action say it doesn't do enough to repeal Obamacare taxes, but supporters like Rick Santorum say the new bill takes that money, gets it out of Washington, which they say should appeal to conservatives.
Correspondent Jason Calvi reporting from Capitol Hill. Thanks, Jason. Recovery is just beginning for the victims of Hurricane Irma. Some areas of Florida are still remain flooded, and many in the battered state don't have electricity. Search and rescue units are still going door to door, hoping to find survivors amid the demolished homes in the Florida Keys. On the east coast of Florida, power will likely be restored this weekend, but on the west coast, where Hurricane Irma made landfall, it may take until next week for the lights and air conditioning to come back on. Catholic parishes in Houston are hoping the federal government will reimburse them in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. Federal officials have told them church buildings are not eligible for reimbursement, but school buildings might be. A group of non-Catholic churches in Texas have filed a lawsuit against FEMA, saying they are being denied disaster relief grants due to their religious status. North Korea fires an unidentified ballistic missile over Japan toward the North Pacific Ocean. The launch comes just hours after North Korea condemned the United Nations Security Council's vote for additional sanctions. Today's launch triggered warning sirens in northern Japan for the second time in less than a month. North Korea is just one of many topics world leaders will address at the United Nations General Assembly in the week ahead. We are sending an EWTN News Nightly crew to New York City next week. Be sure to watch my reports from the UN Monday and Tuesday.
إلى ذوي ضحايا العملية الإرهابية في ذي قار.
A spokesman for Iraq's Shia religious establishment condemns an attack that killed more than 80 people near an Iraqi checkpoint yesterday. It was claimed by ISIS. During the Friday prayers, he called on the government to better protect its citizens. A high-ranking priest working in the Vatican's embassy in Washington has been recalled after prosecutors asked for him to be charged and face trial in a child pornography investigation. The president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference says in a statement, "While we don't know all the facts consistent with our charter, we reaffirm that when such allegations occur, an immediate, thorough, and transparent investigation should begin in cooperation with law enforcement and immediate steps be taken to protect children." Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us now. Edward, what do we know about this diplomat and the accusations against him?
Well, we know that he's a senior figure in the nunciature. He's a diplomat. He's one of three counselors, we understand. He's not the apostolic nuncio. We don't know his nationality, and we don't know anything more about him, really. But we do know that he was caught in possession of child pornography. He wasn't disseminating it in any way. but he was in possession of it, and an investigation has been opened to find out more.
Well, those are pretty harsh accusations here. So what's likely to happen next?
Well, if precedent is anything to go by, it's likely that he'll have, if these accusations are found to be true, then he's going to be, or at least have evidence of them, that he's going to be probably put under a trial in the Vatican. There'll be some sort of hearing, and he'll be laicized. But that, of course, all depends on how much evidence they get from the U.S. authorities who brought this case to light.
Well, Edward, the Vatican has recalled envoys before. What is the precedent there for this case?
Well, there was a recent precedent. There was a previous diplomat in 2013, Monsignor Joseph Wasilewski, a Polish apostolic nuncio in the Dominican Republic, was caught, was accused rather of having of child abuse, but also once he was recalled to the Vatican, he was then caught in possession of child pornography. He was laicized, he was brought to trial, but he died of natural causes before the trial could get underway. I think if this case is similar, then you can expect the same sort of process for this diplomat who was caught in, who was under investigation in the Apostolic Nunciature in Washington.
It is a disturbing accusations and a very disturbing case, but one that's important that we bring to light. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, thanks so much for talking with us about it.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Christian persecution continues to those who practice their faith all over the world. The Martyr's Oath is a new book that captures eyewitness stories of hope and courage from people who have survived Christian persecution in 30 countries. We're joined by the author of The Martyr's Oath, Johnny Moore. He's also the author of Defying ISIS and a member of the White House Faith Advisory Council. Welcome back, Johnny.
Really good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Your book captures stories of people practicing their faith under pretty horrific conditions. One country you focus on is Nigeria, and you capture some of these stories where Boko Haram obviously is a place that's killed more Christians even before ISIS showed up, and you write about Rose in Nigeria. Tell me about her story.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little lady that we interviewed in Nigeria. Boko Haram showed up in her house one night. They beheaded her husband, beheaded her children, and they're chasing after Rose as she's leaving. And the terrorists, or Boko Haram terrorists, are saying, you know, say Allah Akbar, say Allah. They're trying to do as they've done in so many places in the world, trying to convert her on the spot, right? Rose, this Christian woman, Allah Akbar. They're chasing her with the same knife they used to kill her husband and her kids in front of her eyes. And what you find in the Martyr's Oath is the transcript of her testimony to us, the actual words she told us. And here's what she said, Wyatt. She said, every time, they're chasing her out, slicing as they're going. She's running, running, running. Every time they told me to say Allah Akbar, she said, I looked back at them and I screamed, Jesus. Allah Akbar, Jesus. Allah Akbar, Jesus. And this is just like a little lady in Nigeria.
Pretty incredible. You challenge the readers of the book to take the Martyr's Oath, and you refer back to it throughout the book. Tell me exactly what is the Martyr's Oath and how does it help people's faith?
Yeah, well, I entitled the book The Martyr's Oath because of an experience I had in India about 15 years ago. I attended a Bible school graduation, and at the end of this graduation service, there was an extra step. They all had to stand up and they had to take a Martyr's Oath. They had to pledge that they weren't willing to just live for Jesus, but if it cost them their life, they were willing to give their life. Because in our Christian theology, you know, we as Christians, we are willing to die for Jesus, not because of anything we'll get from him, but because we've already been given his grace, his forgiveness, his love. When we face a moment of conversion, convert or die, like so many Christians in northern Iraq, Syria, and many other countries in the world, including India and Nigeria and other places, many Christians have chosen to be willing to die for Jesus at the drop of a dime. And so I encourage people to thoughtfully, prayerfully ask themselves. You can go to martyrsoath.com. You can actually read the oath and decide if you're willing, you know, to do that. Are you willing to live for a Jesus they're so willing to die for? And, you know, I actually took that Martyr's Oath 15 years ago, and I prayed and I fasted before I took it, because it's such a powerful thing.
Such an important message, and one that's vital in this day and age. Johnny Moore, author of The Martyr's Oath, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, a conservative commentator speaks on the campus of UC Berkeley. We'll tell you whether it brought the protests like earlier this year. And it's the end of the line for one NASA spacecraft.
I'm going to call this the end of mission.
Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee in for Lauren Ashburn. Harvard University is revoking a visiting fellowship from Bradley Manning, the former U.S. soldier convicted of espionage. The school's dean calls the decision a mistake and says he didn't intend to honor Manning. Harvard says Manning, a transgender who goes by Chelsea, is still welcome to participate in a student forum, but won't be considered a fellow. Manning was released from prison in May after then-President Obama commuted the 35-year sentence. Police say protests at UC Berkeley Thursday were not violent as former Breitbart editor Ben Shapiro gave a talk on campus. Hundreds of protesters voiced their displeasure over Shapiro's speech. The liberal university has become known for its violent demonstrations. Conservative commentator Ann Coulter canceled an appearance there in April. Our next guest wrote a related blog titled, "This is not a daycare, it's a university." He told our Lauren Ashburn today's culture has taught our kids to be self-absorbed and narcissistic.
Joining us via Skype is Dr. Everett Piper, who wrote the viral blog and is president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. He's the author of Not a Daycare. Welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at a part of the blog post that you wrote that went viral. It says, "This past week, I actually had a student come forward after a university chapel service and complain because he felt victimized by a sermon on 1 Corinthians 13, which was in my wedding, by the way. It appears that this young scholar felt offended because a homily on love made him feel bad for not showing love." What's this about?
It's about teaching bad ideas for decades and reaping the negative consequences of those ideas. Richard Weaver told us in his seminal work in 1948 that ideas have consequences. That was its title. And what was his point? Ideas have consequences, they matter. And when you teach self-absorption and narcissism for some 20, 30, 40 years, we should not be surprised to find self-absorbed and narcissistic students in our campuses and in our culture. The chickens are coming home to roost. Bad ideas, like your grandmother said, garbage in, garbage out.
Garbage out, right. And God doesn't make junk. That was another one I think my grandmother had. But what I love about your book, and I have read it and have done my highlighting and my homework, is that chapter 2 is called The Snowflake Insanity. What do you mean by that? And there may be members of our audience who don't know what snowflakes or who snowflakes are.
It's a term that's been used to dub the present generation, the millennials, who are so fragile and so gentle that anytime anybody expresses an idea that turns up the heat, they melt. And what they do is they cry for safe spaces. They cry that is a microaggression, and that you should have issued a trigger warning before you talked to me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. And my challenge to the generation and anybody else listening is that if you expect me to coddle you and comfort you rather than confront you, you're in the wrong place. Good education, the best education, builds your character. It doesn't just make you feel comfortable.
Well, you also expressed dismay that colleges used to be a place to express free speech. And, you know, as president of a Christian organization or a university, you also warn parents. You're saying to them, there are 3 different kinds of Christian schools that these kids can attend. What do you mean by that?
Well, don't trust the 4-color brochure. You need to ask the right questions, because many institutions will market themselves as being Christ-centered, but do they actually hire faculty that believe in Christ? And the answer, I know from behind the scenes, is no. So you need to ask questions before you put your money on the barrelhead. I would ask 2 simple questions. What's your view of truth, and what's your view of Scripture? Do you believe that truth is an objective reality given by God, or do you think it's a postmodern construct created by man? And do you believe the Scriptures are inerrant, infallible, and authoritative, or is it just interesting literature? The answer to those 2 questions will tell you whether or not you should trust that institution with your son or daughter's heart, mind, and soul.
And it sounds to me like yours is the latter. Dr. Everett Piper, yes, president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, author of Not a Daycare. Thank you so much for joining us.
Honored, thank you.
And our thanks to Lauren Ashburn for that interview. NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida announces it has sustained damage from Hurricane Irma. A damage assessment and recovery team identified structures and facilities that were damaged or flooded. NASA closed the center ahead of Irma's onset, and only a small team of specialists, known as the Ride-Out Team, stayed behind.
The signal from the spacecraft is gone.
It's the end of the road for NASA's Cassini spacecraft. After 13 years exploring Saturn and its moons, NASA says Cassini deliberately crashed into the planet today to avoid the possibility of colliding with one of the planet's moons. Up next, breaking down the results of a Pew Research study on world religions. Plus, working at the White House, the president hires an 11-year-old for the day.
Dice madre, dice donna forte e coraggiosa.
Pope Francis focuses on Our Lady of Sorrows, whose feast is celebrated today. During Mass this morning, the Holy Father said Mary was always with Jesus, even standing next to him at the foot of the cross. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsbee in for Lauren Ashburn. By the year 2070, the number of Muslims could equal the number of Christians around the world. That's according to a study by the Pew Research Center. Over the next 4 decades, Christians will still be the largest religious group, but Islam will grow faster than any other major religion and make up 30% of the world's population. We're joined by Conrad Hackett, Associate Director of Research and Senior Demographer at Pew Research Center, to help us break down the study. Conrad, your study shows the religious landscape in the world is changing at a very rapid rate, relatively speaking. Give us a snapshot of what the trends are and what's going to happen by 2050.
Well, the biggest pattern is that while Christians are the largest group in the world, Muslims are growing fastest, twice as fast as the world's population, about twice as fast as Christians, who are roughly keeping pace with global population growth. And in the decades ahead, eventually, we think that if we go out a little bit beyond 2050, that Muslims will eventually outnumber Christians when we get to about the year 2075 or so.
It's very interesting. We have a graph that shows that we want to show. It gives you a little bit more detail about the population growth. It shows, as you were saying about Muslims, the only major religious group projected to have that increase at a faster rate. Christianity is number 2, but it's so far down when you just look at the graph itself. What exactly is happening with the growth rate of Christianity itself?
Christians are growing rapidly in some parts of the world, but in Europe, for example, which 100 years ago was where 2 out of 3 Christians lived, the population hasn't kept pace, and in recent years there have been more Christians dying than babies born to Christians in Europe in particular. So there's kind of a geographic shift away from Europe and towards Africa in particular and Asia Pacific, where Christian populations are growing. And the growth in those other regions is why globally Christians are outpacing all religious groups except for Muslims as far as growth goes. So it's a mix of a decline in some parts of the world, Western nations, as a share of the population, but then growth in the global South.
One other interesting factor here in this study has to do with conversion from one religion to another and how that kind of factors in. Tell me a little bit about how you calculate conversions and what religions are growing in terms of converting.
Yeah, we looked at survey data where people tell us the religion they were raised in and their religion today. And there's religious change in many different directions. But the biggest pattern in the 70 countries where we have such data is that there are a lot of people in these countries who say they grew up Christian and now no longer identify with a religion. And as far as other religions go, there's movement in and out, but the biggest movement is from Christianity to the ranks of the unaffiliated.
Yeah, or the nuns, atheists,
yes,
that
sure.
kind of thing. Very interesting, and I know that you guys will continue to calculate this, like I said, for the decades to come. Conrad Hackett, Pew Research Center, thanks so much for talking with us.
My pleasure, thank you.
Finally tonight, President Trump responds to a written request from an 11-year-old.
Dear Mr. President, it would be my honor to mow the White House lawn for some weekend for you.
Well, today the president took up Frank Ghiaccio on that offer. He helped mow the lawn at the Rose Garden. Frank says he started his own business mowing neighbors' lawns in Falls Church, Virginia. He says his services today were provided free of charge. We spoke to him after his work was done.
It was really cool, especially when the president came.
The president even invited the family into the Oval Office. We also learned Frank and his family are Catholic. Frank has been an altar server for the past 3 years. Seek and you shall find, and knock and the White House doors will be open to you, I guess. We thank you for watching the entire week. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsbee. We'll be back here on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.